Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we will be continuing to read Out of the Shadows, Reimagining Gay Men's Lives by Walt Odets-Some. We're now on Chapter 5, Some Obstructions to Self-Discovery and Self-Realization, Diagnosis, Isolation, and Grief. When the palace was rebuilt, the pictures, burned along with so much else, flammable details of a pile given to the flames, had to be painted again. Painted necessarily by artists not from those past times the pictures came from. Keith Wardrop from The Not Forever. Diagnosis, the story of Paul. Many readers will notice that I have not yet used the term post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD, as it is now popularly known, is a diagnosis offered in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, which is conceived of and published by the American Psychiatric Association, APA. Today most often discussed in connection with combat survivors, PTSD is an abbreviation used to indicate a constellation of real-world signs and symptoms that survivors of trauma sometimes experience. This diagnostic term is thus simply a label for that constellation. And as with much psychiatric diagnosis, the very fact of the label can be harmful and can obstruct the recovery of men living in the aftermath of traumatic combat, early gay life experience, or the two HIV epidemics. Gay people were considered diagnosable long before the idea of PTSD was conceived in 1980, and the diagnoses have caused untold harm. Much of it is still unresolved. Diagnosis of homosexuality or ego-dystonic homosexuality remained in the DSM through the terrifying first half-decade of the early epidemic, until, in 1986, they were finally expunged. What they left in their wake was a legacy of emotional injury that is still alive today. The stigmatization of gay people has always been a societal problem for which gay people have been blamed, and psychiatry, which has too often been a professional mouthpiece for mindless social norms, has played a significant role in inverting the blame. If the trauma gay people have experienced were more broadly recognized, perhaps PTSD would be the new diagnosis of choice. But the use of the label would likely only do further harm, and it would require an acknowledgement that is unlikely to be made. It would force psychiatry to look at the very trauma it had helped create through the abusive use of diagnosis. Diagnosis is the foundation of the contemporary conceptualization of mental health. If we were to take the DSM compendium of diagnosable disorders seriously, everyone would fall in one of two spheres, normal and healthy, or abnormal and ill. The 947 pages of the most recent DSM offer 265 disorders to choose from, many of them species. But while psychiatry was pathologizing gay people with diagnosis, society was a step ahead. Being homosexual was worse than having a disorder. It was being a monstrosity. A 27-year-old man once said to me, "When I left my family and moved to San Francisco to come out, I thought to myself, you are abandoning your family so you can be a monster." The idea was not this young man's invention, nor was it the invention of Freud. During the 1950s and 60s, many prominent, presumably authoritative APA member psychiatrists, including the notorious Charles Socarides and Robert Spitzer, supported the idea of monstrosity by describing gay people as diseased, sexual psychopaths. Such characterizations not only countered the nascent homophile movement for gay civil rights, they furthered the widespread societal stigma and violence directed at gay people and brought untold emotional damage to millions of gay and lesbian Americans. In his wonderfully researched and thoughtful book about the history of early gay equality movements in the United States, John D'Amelio tells a story about the 1968 American Medical Association annual meeting in San Francisco. As the AMA prepared for its annual convention in June 1968, the editor of the San Francisco Medical Society Bulletin warned the arriving doctors to be on guard against brigades of harlots and homosexuals. At the convention itself, Psychiatrists spoke of homosexuality as a dreadful dysfunction, malignant in character, which has risen to epidemic proportions. When he called upon the federal government to finance national centers for the cure and rehabilitation of the sexual deviant, homophile movement leaders held a well-received press conference where they likened his proposal to a final solution. Stigmatization by psychiatry has had the unfortunate consequence of long deterring gay people from seeking help to address the emotional consequences of that stigmatization. The discussion of emotional issues, the feeling goes, risks offering yet another opportunity for stigmatization. Troubling feelings suggest the need for help. Needing help looks like pathological weakness and personal failure, and weakness and failure validate the stigma. Asking psychiatry for help is particularly problematic because it is psychiatry that defined gay people as pathological in the first place. While this common apprehension about seeking help is understandable, all human beings, even men, sometimes have troubling feelings, and members of societally stigmatized minorities often have more. Members of minorities who are also survivors of trauma often experience troubling feelings. How could they not? This assertion is not a confirmation of pathology or weakness. It is an acknowledgement of the truth about normal human responses to adversity. Even as our frequent denial of this truth is understandable, acknowledgement of and attention to our feelings are much more helpful. Authentic strength lies in our own thoughtful attention to our vulnerabilities, not our denial of them. Psychiatric diagnosis does more than stigmatize people and alienate them from potentially useful support. Diagnosis can also reduce the quality of care that people receive when they do come for help, because diagnosis is too easily mistaken for insight by both provider and patient. We obviously need to know certain things to be helpful to a person in emotional pain. What he is feeling, how he experiences those feelings, and how he expresses them in his life. It is also usually helpful to know the history behind the feelings. After doing this deductive work, it might then be useful to attach a diagnostic label simply for communicating the observations quickly and succinctly, possibly for the suggestion of useful treatment approach, and possibly to help guide further deductive exploration suggested by a diagnostic label. But in itself, the diagnostic label has told us nothing that we did not ourselves observe or hear from the patient. The diagnosis has provided a name, not insight. Despite the illusion imparted by a diagnosis, people do not usually have an emotional issue in the sense of having a cold or a bacterial infection. Unlike medical diagnosis, few psychiatric diagnoses describe an underlying cause with a clearly useful course of treatment or a reliable prognosis. Depression, as one example, is not something people have. It is an experience, a way of experiencing oneself and the world. Some people, characteristically, or in the shorter term, in an acute response to life events, have depressed feelings and sometimes live out the feelings in ways that are problematic and self-perpetuating. The useful deductive investigation is about when and why the person first became depressed, how he is experiencing the depression, and how the depression might be creating further problems. Today, a psychiatric diagnosis often leads immediately to the use of psychotropic medication, a practice that furthers the avoidance of exploring and understanding feelings. Such medications, antidepressants being the most widely used today, are appropriate and useful for some people, some of the time. But antidepressants do not usually address underlying causes and obviously do not change the depressing real-world facts of a life. While they are certainly not happy pills, the FDA is unlikely to approve anything that makes people too happy. They do sometimes help shift subjective experience in ways that allow the person to make useful changes in how he lives his life. Less usefully, antidepressants can also make unchanged, intolerable lives feel more tolerable by flattening the entire range of emotional experience. If someone is depressed because he is unnecessarily isolated and lonely, a medication used as the sole form of treatment to make the isolation more tolerable is a questionable approach. Too often, the diagnosis of an emotional issue and the prescription of a drug to treat it is the psychiatric equivalent of coffee and aspirin for fatigue and fever. No deductive investigation is made into what is causing the fatigue and fever, nor is any attempt made to directly treat that cause. We simply treat the symptoms and leave it at that. Unfortunately, the fatigue and fever diagnosis legitimizes the prescription, and the prescription validates the diagnosis. Because we have depression, we use an antidepressant, and the fact that we are using it confirms that we have the depressive disorder. Chronic fatigue and fever is not a medical diagnosis, and no competent physician would settle for it or simply prescribe for it without further deductive investigation. American psychiatry and the pharmaceutical industry that supports its work does that all the time. In addition to the professional push for a diagnostic conceptualization of our emotional lives, an important pull for diagnosis comes from those who are being diagnosed. I see two primary responses from therapy patients who have been given a psychiatric diagnosis, almost always by someone other than me. One is fear or discouragement about having a disorder and being labeled ill. The other is relief that a useful discovery has finally been made, and by virtue of having an identified disorder, the patient is relieved of fault and blame for his condition. Sometimes people feel both responses simultaneously, though many voice only the relief. Therapy patients thus often appreciate a diagnosis and often ask for one. Instead of simply providing it, I usually try to talk about what it would mean to have one. And our most frequent discovery is that it would relieve the man of uncertainty about his life and his feelings of culpability and shame. Many of the abbreviations for psychiatric diagnosis end in a D for good reason. D stands for disease, disorder, or dysfunction, as in ADHD, PTSD, or a male favorite and pharmaceutical golden goose, ED, for erectile dysfunction. The patient has a disorder, has an FDA-approved prescription medication to prove it, and is no longer to blame for his failures. Inattention or hyperactivity, depression or anxiety, or flaccid penis. Such relief from responsibility is often helpful because it lessens the ridiculous burden of culpability placed on those who are not normal because they are not feeling what they and others feel they ought to feel. I am completely supportive of the effort to relieve people of culpability and self-blame for emotional issues. But diagnosis sometimes leads to reinforcing stagnation in the troubled feelings. With a diagnosis, the patient has an illness which is not his doing and over which he has no control. He identifies more strongly with the feelings, and they become more deeply entrenched in his sense of who he is. If he's told the truth, that the diagnosis is a label for a constellation of feelings and symptoms that we understand relatively little about, but that people do improve, even if a definite diagnosis and course of treatment is unknown, he might have a less entrenched identification with the problem. He might also build or sustain a realistic hope of actively working through the problem, rather than settling quietly in with it, or waiting passively for someone else or his medication to cure it. Diagnoses do not in themselves resolve anything, and they do not usually even get people completely off the culpability hook. Few depressed people really feel that they simply have a disease through no fault of their own. They may assert the diagnosis as a defense against anticipated blame from others, but they continue to feel somehow culpable. The sense of culpability and the shame it breeds is destructive and keeps our problematic emotional issues entrenched. As a psychotherapist, one of the most useful observations I have made is that everyone plays the best hand he can muster at any particular moment in his life. No one plays the second best hand because, if he does, the decision to play it is his best hand at that moment. This observation reveals at least two obvious, but sometimes startling facts. We are not completely in control of our emotional lives, and we do not conduct our lives in hindsight. In 2012, I began seeing Paul in therapy. An attractive, noticeably effeminate 44-year-old. He had a history of depression starting in adolescence. He had also lived in New York through much of the early epidemic, but had remained HIV negative. A week after his partner Francis's death in 1998, Paul had attempted suicide with a lethal dose of Francis medication, but had vomited before respiratory arrest. He was psychiatrically hospitalized and, after released, moved to San Francisco. Martin, the San Francisco psychiatrist who had been handling Paul's relatively complex medication regimen for the past few years, suggested to Paul that he see me for talk therapy. Paul told me that Martin had diagnosed him as bipolar 2 after their second meeting. It was the first diagnosis that Paul felt maybe rang true. The medication regimen seemed appropriate for the diagnosis, but the personal history Paul related to me did not obviously support the diagnosis. After I had a decent sense of Paul's life experience, and when we had 4 or 5 sessions together, Paul and I had conversation about his diagnosis and what it meant to him. "What do you feel about the diagnosis that Martin made?" I asked Paul. "You mean the bipolar?" "Yes." "Did he make another?" "No, just the bipolar." I guess I was very relieved. Why relieved? That's a good question. I've never thought about it, but I guess to finally just have a sense of what's going on. It's the first time someone may have put his finger on it, and Martin says he's hopeful that we can get the medication right. He says he thinks I can have a happier life. I've been living with this since I was a teenager, so it gives me hope. We haven't gotten very far with the medication yet, but I'm hoping. I imagine the diagnosis also makes it easier for others to understand you. Oh, absolutely. People I know have been saying to me for years, "Why don't you get out and meet people?" Or this and that. Everyone has suggestion. And now they understand that it's more complicated than that. I explained to them what bipolar 2 is, and they understand. Even my parents understand. Even your parents? Paul laughed. My father's out in the zone, and my mother isn't a whole lot better. No, she's better, but not what you'd hope for. But I think they're relieved, too, to know what the problem is. I suppose it gets them off the hook, particularly my mother. She spent years telling my father that it wasn't her fault, and my father spent years ignoring her by watching TV sports. Wasn't her fault for what? Oh, everything. My being gay and girly, that's the big one. That's always been the big one. Then all the rest of it. What is all the rest? Being sick, spending high school hiding under the covers, no friends, no sports, practically every kid in school calling me a fag and punching me. No nothing except straight A's, which they didn't much pay attention to. My mother used to say to people, "Paul is our little genius," but not beyond being able to say that. She couldn't have cared less. I think they were mostly thinking, oh, if only Paul wasn't a fag and such an obvious one. I think they've rejected my whole life. Definitely my living with Francis for 8 years, whom they couldn't stand. He was even more effeminate than I am, and I insisted on bringing him home when I visited. He was the only real friend I've had. The only one. My dearest friend. But my parents, well, the whole thing, my whole life, not just Francis. I think I was a disappointment to them, starting maybe a week after they brought me home from the hospital. I probably threw up on one of them, and that was the end of that romance. If, indeed, there was even one. So the bipolar 2 helps with all of this? I think it gives them a reason, just like it gives me a reason. It sounds as if they've been quite hostile to you for most of your life. And your adolescent life at school also sounds filled with hostility. With your parents, does the diagnosis help with any of that? Do your parents express any apology, empathy, support, or anything like that? I'm just remembering that there was a girl, Marilyn, in high school who had something really wrong with her legs, and the kids used to call her Gim. I remember feeling bad for her, but I never talked to her, never made friends with her, even though I think I liked her. I feel bad just thinking about it, because I think I didn't want to be associated with someone else who had a problem. I was afraid, and I let her down. It would have been, the gimp and the fag. It makes me feel like calling her up now and apologizing. Paul stood speaking and seemed to be thinking about what he had just said. What about getting a hold of her and talking? I asked. It sounds like it might be helpful for both of you. What came to my mind was, now she's probably one of those New Hampshire fag haters, like my father. Maybe she always was. Paul had survived a childhood and adolescence with both a very unsupportive, perhaps hostile family and an overly hostile school environment. Both were exacerbated, I would be sure, by his effeminacy. In 1990, at the age of 20, he had left New Hampshire and moved to New York. The early epidemic was on its trajectory to its destructive apex, and gay men were dying, by Paul's description, almost as quickly as I met them. About 2 years after arriving in New York, Paul met Frances. They lived together for 8 years. Frances died of HIV-related causes. After the death and Paul's determined suicide attempt and hospitalization, Paul moved to San Francisco. There, he had almost immediately found work as an advertising copywriter and, by his own description, had been highly successful. When I first met him, he had worked for the same large agency for many years and felt that he was well liked within the copywriting group he managed. Personally, however, Paul remained isolated, had hardly dated, and lived with a mood he described as permanently down, except for the vacations. He had only the most casual of friends. He had small rallies of mood occasionally, his vacations, which were the hypomanic episodes that Martin had used to qualify the bipolar II diagnosis. The vacations were brief, however, and only in relation to his baseline mood might they be considered even hypomanic. In my impression, the up mood swing seemed reactive to the depression. Paul's attempts to rally himself out from under the weight of his normal deeply sad and listless mood, but he could not sustain them. Accounting for the fact that psychiatric diagnosis is not even remotely related to science, I could buy the bipolar II diagnosis. But the origins of Paul's mood problems were readily apparent in his history, and we did not need a diagnosis to understand them. He had a largely stigmatized first 20 years, and he had learned in early childhood to elevate his mood by entertaining others with stories and skits that garnered approval, deflecting many painful feelings. Paul's mother had a second description for Paul. Sometimes, instead of being the family's little genius, Paul was our little entertainer. The cheerful little entertainer concealed a deep well of unhappiness that no one talked about. Currently, his hypomanic episodes were expressed in entertaining others with lavish and animated dinner parties at his flat, after which he would lie in bed for 2 days, which is why I only do them on Friday nights. The guests were acquaintances, not friends. While I never questioned the diagnosis in discussion with Paul, with his permission, I did have a single phone conversation with Martin. He said to me, "Paul's a very unhappy, very likable guy whom I really wanted to help. I don't know if he's bipolar or not, but that's about as close as I could get. I hope you can do something for him. He's worth the time, and he's smart, he has guts, and he's still motivated after all these years." Even as Paul was hopeful about the possibility of a successful medication regimen, neither he nor Martin seemed to take the diagnosis seriously. Had the diagnosis led to a useful medication regimen, particularly one that did not also significantly limit Paul's life through emotional constriction, that would certainly have been worthwhile, but the medication, in both Paul's and Martin's estimation, had not been of much use, and that was why Martin wanted Paul to talk with me. Early in our work together, Paul was doubtful that he had a traumatizing experience in childhood and adolescence, and that the epidemic and the loss of Frances had re-engaged the feelings of the earlier trauma. Part of his doubtful response to my suggestion that he had endured a lot of trauma had obvious origins. He had simply never thought of his life experience in such terms because it was all he had ever known. "It's just life," he said to me, "and everyone has a life, don't they?" But Paul had another important reason for doubting that. For much of his life, he had lived through trauma. Like many people, Paul experienced the description of adversity as stigmatizing, as an indictment of him, much the way people sometimes experience being diagnosed with a disorder. Paul heard the description of a traumatized life as if it were a diagnosis, a description of something that he had or was. And he was not as comfortable with this diagnosis as he had been with the concrete diagnosis of bipolar II. In my developmental description, he clearly recognized his life. It felt true, while the diagnosis felt relatively objective and external. History is something we have lived, a diagnosis is something we are called, and the history is often more difficult to accept. As Paul began to accept the historical truths of his traumatic developmental experience, other feelings began to come up. He felt that his history was somehow his failure, and that as a result he was damaged goods. He thought that he should have had the strength to be unaffected by his life experience, and that if he was, his weakness had allowed it. He told me, "I can accept the reality of my life going way back, but I have never thought of myself as a product of it. It was history, and I guess I thought I was immune. I don't want to be affected by it." As he worked together weekly for about 3 years, Paul became progressively more aware that he had survived a string of traumas that culminated in Frances's death, that he was not the perpetrator of that history, and that he had had a normal and comprehensible emotional response to the course his life had taken. He was also gradually able to accept, partly due to my consistent acceptance of him and my refusal to pathologize his feelings, that he was not culpable because he was gay or effeminate, because he had made a suicide attempt, or because he had experienced some lifelong depression. With this unburdening insight, he let go of a great deal of shame. As our work proceeded, the significance of the bipolar diagnosis waned, and memories of his life experience became more accessible and useful. As a child from Mercury raised by reactionary New Hampshire Earthlings, Paul was a resolute and valiant survivor of serious developmental trauma that was painfully revisited in the early epidemic and the terrible loss of Frances. It was in acknowledging and understanding these experiences that he was able to slowly make changes in his current life. He developed more social connections, more than I've had in years, and as one result, saw some noticeable improvement in his mood, energy, and engagement in life. With Martin's help, Paul tapered off most of his medication, but he continued on a single drug, the antidepressant Lexapro, which Paul found helpful. His new life was not a fresh start, but it was subjectively and objectively substantially happier. Some people with adverse developmental histories like Paul's, particularly those who have less characteristic resilience, can be more difficult to help. But Paul did have resilience. Martin told me this on the phone, and I first heard it from Paul when he told me that he had persevered in being accompanied by Frances during visits to his parents' home. During our work together, Paul's resilience and tenacity repeatedly made themselves apparent. A more comprehending, generous, and humane developmental experience would have allowed Paul a happier life with more possibilities, and he will probably never completely surmount some of the limitations exposed by what he did have. But, as Martin said on the phone, Paul is worth the time. Paul is one of the honest, tenacious, good-hearted gay men that I have been fortunate to meet and work with. Although not what the Earthlings had in mind, Paul is authentically himself. He is an important kind of hero, and one I greatly admire.